Well, welcome everybody to the 2024 Melbourne Energy Institute Annual Symposium. We've been running this symposium now for, I think, 8 years, and it's been a tremendous event that brings together many wonderful speakers from outside the university, but also promotes the wonderful research by postgraduate students and postdoctoral research fellows and, let's say, younger or less old academic staff at the University of Melbourne. My name's Michael Breer and I'm the Director of the Melbourne Energy Institute, and I'm very, very pleased to open today's event, and I'm honoured to have as our opening speaker Anna Skarbek, who's the CEO of Climateworks. Before I introduce Anna, I will of course acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this event is being held, and we of course acknowledge their elders past and present. Now, Anna, I won't read it because I know Anna very well, but Anna's been doing her current job for even longer than I've been MEI Director. So Anna's CEO of the Climateworks Centre. I think you started there, since 2009. There you go. Which is amazing because she and I are only 35 years of age. And many of you know Climateworks' work very well, so I don't need to go into much detail of that. It's a wonderful centre, and has been running it for now 15 years. Golly, seems like yesterday. And Anna's going to be talking today about obviously very relevant things to all of us. Matching ambition by design, aligning the energy system with renewable superpower expectations. So ambition with design. So we all, or the large majority of us, would like the same things, but those things are very ambitious. So how can we actually step up and really achieve what we need to achieve? That I think is a wonderful, noble objective, and Anna's going to be giving us her thoughts on that today. So please welcome Anna Skarbek. Thank you. So there'll be Q&A after the lecture, plenty of time. So.
Thank you, Michael, and good morning, everyone. I too acknowledge that we're gathered here on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I extend my respect to their elders past and present. We are of course privileged in Australia to have access not only to new knowledge and technologies, but that which has existed for thousands and thousands of years. And so as you embark on your conversations over the course of this day and beyond, I encourage you to reflect on the unique opportunities and the impacts that the deployment of renewables can have on First Nations communities, and the opportunity to engage First Nations communities as rights holders as well as stakeholders, and to share the insight and wisdom that can be gained from genuine collaboration. Of course, you're all here because we are living in the highly complex transformation of our electricity and energy systems. We know that the success or failure of the transition to renewables will in many ways define Australia's contribution to a decarbonised world. So the stakes are enormous, and advancing our understanding of the opportunities and limitations presented by the energy transformation is indispensable. So I'm glad to see you all here today and contributing your careers to this. And thank you, MEI, for hosting this symposium, and I'm honoured to be here to share some thoughts with you today. Your work, your research and innovations fit into a wider picture of energy transformation that incorporates governments and governance bodies, laws and regulations, investors and communities. And it's that interplay that I will explore today. I'll set out the new normal of net zero that's being incorporated into private sector and public sector governance and planning and investment. And I'll share some recommendations on what this means for the energy sector. So, why is it that I say that net zero is the new normal? As Michael mentioned, in 2024, we've marked 15 years of operations of Climateworks Centre. having been established in 2009 between the Monash University and MEI Foundation partnership. So over those 15 years, I have witnessed a very marked shift in the consensus on climate change and the perceived viability of net zero. When we think back to when we started in 2009, the Rudd government's carbon pollution reduction scheme had failed to pass the Senate. The renewables were about 10% of the NEM. Now they're at 40, going to 50. There were no national pathways for reducing emissions. Michael knows, having developed some, as have Climateworks, now government agencies are developing their own. And we were still talking about what was then called clean coal. Of course, in these 15 years, we've seen things change substantially. Within a decade of back then, every state and territory government and major bank had a net zero emissions target, and that was followed a year later by Australia's government submitting its net zero emissions commitment to the UN Paris Agreement process. And then 2 years ago, the Australian Parliament enshrined the national net zero and greenhouse gas emissions targets into law. Further, laws that have been passed this year include legislation to require major companies to include their in their annual financial reports their emissions targets and climate transition plans. And government itself is developing 6 net zero sector plans as part of its national net zero 2050 plan to be released early next year. And just yesterday, the government announced that the Future Fund will direct investment into that the Future Fund may now, and is directed by government, to invest in green energy to drive economic growth while delivering strong returns for Australia. These are some of the conditions which demonstrate that we find ourselves now in a time where net zero is the new normal for doing business and government. Of course, much of the implementation is still challenged or challenging, but it's no longer in question that governments, businesses, financial institutions and communities recognise that we are moving to a clean, future-proofed economy and that we must do so rapidly. And if we do, and with ambition, we can deliver tremendous financial, social and environmental benefits. We saw earlier this year the Australian government seek to capitalise on that opportunity by allocating $22 billion to the Future Made in Australia Act. And this framework is designed to build Australia's renewable energy and product export industries to take advantage of the country's unique access to wind, solar and critical minerals, infrastructure and skilled workforces. The budget papers for this program expressly reference Australia's ambition to be a renewable energy superpower. And so, to deliver on that vision, we know Australia needs an electricity and energy system to match. Over these 15 years, I mentioned Climateworks. Let me just see if this is going to click. Yes. Here we go. No, it's clicking on my screen, but not on the big one. Never mind. I was only going to tell you a little bit about Climateworks and what we've seen in this time. We are now a team of almost 100 people working across all sectors of the economy here in Australia and in Southeast Asia, focusing on solutions-oriented knowledge creation and translation, aimed at those who hold the power to reduce emissions at scale. Here we are. Currently, for example, we have teams working on transport, household energy upgrades, orderly gas phase-out options, defining credibility in corporate transition plans and in sustainable finance taxonomies and indices for share markets. We're working in Indonesia and Australia on supply chains for low-carbon battery manufacturing and minerals extraction, and that's just to name some of our programs, certainly not all. Alongside our programmatic work and our core work has been national pathways for Australia to fulfil its decarbonisation obligations under the Paris Agreement. And our latest iteration of this multi-sector modelling, which we call our decarbonisation scenarios, identifies the priority technologies, pathways and benchmarks for achieving net zero aligned with the Paris Agreement. It's been widely used by government and other stakeholders to inform how the Australian economy can decarbonise. aligned with the Paris goals of staying under 1.5 degrees and well below 2 degrees, including informing the Climate Change Authority's recent advice and to inform the National Energy Sector Plan, and also the Sustainable Finance Taxonomy, which I'll talk more about. So, the 5 shifts that I'll be speaking about today begin with this story about the Australian government having, of course, its target of 82% renewables by 2030. And at face value, that's not far behind what our decarbonisation scenarios show is needed to align with the Paris Agreement, where for the 1.5 aligned temperature goals, we see renewables at 90% by 2030 and close to 100 by the mid-2030s. However, the 82% target that we often hear about was written to discuss decarbonisation of the grid we have today, rather than the grid we need in the future, where we are exporting to a decarbonised global economy. That energy system trajectory is a much larger energy system. And so we are not yet on track to be transitioning to align our domestic and our export economies with the Paris Agreement goals, and to truly be the renewable energy superpower in the vision that's been set out in the budget papers and the Future Made in Australia program framework. So the 5 shifts that I want to discuss today focus on how we can align the energy transformation with these ambitions of net zero and renewable export goals. And I will set through each of these 5 here. Firstly, looking at how the AEMO ISP can set an optimal development plan to enable the NEM to meet Australian government ambition. Secondly, to enable that plan to use place-based system planning and forecasting, such as regional ISPs, to project and meet the energy requirements of the net zero industrial sector. Thirdly, to look at the demand side at the urban scale and ensure that responsibility for effective planning and integration of energy efficiency and management and consumer energy resources and electrification is coordinated. And to bring what we see in the finance sector to the companies in the energy sector by encouraging companies in the NEM to adopt the net zero financial instruments and credible transition plans that are in line with the new Sustainable Finance Taxonomy. And finally, to update the energy market rules and regulations to reflect the requirements of the future energy system, including planning for an orderly phase-out of gas networks. So, let's jump in. The first one I mentioned is to start with the ISP, the Integrated System Plan, and I know you all be familiar with this, providing a 20-year and beyond roadmap for the NEM. Importantly, since 2023, the goals of the ISP that AEMO must adhere to now include reducing emissions in line with net zero targets, along with creating an energy system that's reliable, secure and affordable. So currently, the ISP role is to develop an optimal development path compatible with all of these goals and targets. Its process, however, uses a criteria of a most likely pathway to be identified and subsequently used. And as a result, we see in 2024, that was the step change scenario. The challenge with that is, in parallel, there was the green exports scenario, of course, which is the one that matches the ambition of the renewable energy superpower. And understandably, in the lead up to the 2024 ISP, the analysis of what was most likely was allocated to step change rather than the green exports. The policy instruments for implementing green exports ambition are very, very new, but they are now working their way through legislation. And so we encourage the energy system participants, yourselves included, and particularly those who govern AEMO and provided guidance, to understand more explicitly about the newest legislated ambitions to include renewable exports in Australia's net zero emissions targets. So Climateworks 1.5 aligned pathway is very similar to the green exports scenario. And when we look at what this means for the difference in the energy systems between step change and green energy exports, we find that in the green energy exports pathway, this would deliver a grid with 583 gigawatts of generation capacity and 84 gigawatts of storage capacity, and over 26,000 kilometres additional transmission. The difference in capacity is more than double of what we saw in the step change, which is a NEM of 294 gigawatts of capacity and 64 of storage. So how can our very large industrial centres, energy-intensive businesses with multi-decade infrastructure, plan to meet the export needs of a globally decarbonised economy when the way we've set up our energy system is to plan for the scenario that is not aligned with that? So we suggest that the AEMC's emissions target statement, which is what AEMO must consider when it develops the ISP, can be adjusted. Currently, it pertains only to reduce Australia's domestic emissions, and it doesn't include the targets for our export ambitions. So that is a relatively straightforward fix that in directing AEMO, AEMC can be asked to include the renewable energy superpower policies of the government and the Future Made in Australia ambitions in the emissions target statement for AEMO to draw on as it plans the ISP. The second issue is this most likely test, and we suggest that that can be modified to recognise that there are now formal national legislated targets and goals, and therefore the assessment that AEMO can draw on is not merely what stakeholders think will happen, but what could and should happen to meet the national energy objectives and the targets set out in the broader concept of the emissions target statement. The EMC, that's the Energy Ministerial Council, has already noted that AEMO's role is changing as the energy market rapidly evolves, and that governments and energy sector participants now look to the ISP for guidance on issues across the energy value chain. I'm going to move from this focus to a similar element of drawing on the power of the ISP to provide guidance and to support our emissions intensive industries, to look at regional energy system planning. Here we are. So when thinking about designing the optimal ISP for the nation, we want to also look at what it takes to resolve the chicken and egg issues of transitioning our heavy industry industrial zones. And here is where place-based energy system planning and forecasting in industrial regions is really important. Heavy industries such as iron, steel, aluminium, copper, nickel, zinc, lithium, chemicals, LNG account for over 40% of Australia's total emissions. And mining and manufacturing processes consume over 40% of total energy and electricity. We know as we can transition these sectors away from fossil fuels and still be a strong exporter of minerals, critical minerals, and energy commodities. And we know in doing that, the demand for electricity in these sectors will grow significantly as those sectors shift to electrification away from fossil fuels and draw on production of green hydrogen for their other industrial processes, particularly in chemicals production and aluminium. So we have studied for many years the importance of net zero industrial precincts, where we have found that these industries and their energy intensive infrastructure and the current emissions productions are very clustered. That gives us the opportunity for precinct planning to enable these industries to share resources, workforce talent, and the clean energy sources to leverage what's there already and harness this potential to provide opportunities for those economies, those regional towns, to have a prosperous future when we've decarbonised, but also for our trade partners to have decarbonised products. We now know that state and territory federal governments and the newly legislated Net Zero Economy Authority each have an important role in identifying, authorising, planning and enabling these industrial regions. So as part of our work, Climateworks recently conducted an analysis in the Gladstone industrial region, and it showed here that the ISP step change scenario is likely to fall well short of the electricity capacity needed to rapidly decarbonise in existing industries and establish new renewable export sectors. So our Gladstone projections indicate that demand in that region could reach 74 terawatt hours a year by 2040. But in contrast, when we look at the step change scenario, it shows that the forecasted electricity consumption for those same industries in all of Queensland is around half that, at 44 terawatts a year. So this highlights the need for detailed region-specific energy system planning. And that planning would feed into the ISP's optimal development path that I spoke about earlier. And ideally, we see a system supported by regional ISPs for all of Australia's major industrial zones in support of those net zero transitions in each of those precincts. This then, of course, better guides the deployment of all of the energy infrastructure across the generation, storage and transmission spectrum, and gives the regional industry investors and communities the confidence that they need to move away from fossil fuels and make the investments to build the clean energy future that's the shared national ambition. This is the chicken and egg challenge that we're really focused on recognising needs to be overcome, and we now see the new Net Zero Economy Authority with an express mandate to help attract investment, provide policy coordination, and focus on the regions. Combine that with the $22 billion and more of federal budget support for these renewable export ambitions, and we have the pieces of puzzle to draw together, and the energy system can play a more active part in making the regional ISP a part of the design of those net zero industrial zones. And therefore ensure that we can attract the private investment as well alongside that public investment to support the demand side of that energy use in industry. So that brings me to the demand side of energy use in the urban scale. And we recognise that there is fragmented oversight of energy efficiency and management, electrification and distributed energy resources, which collectively I'll refer to as energy performance. I know many of you know energy performance can play a critical role in achieving the national energy objectives and reducing the need for investment in grid-scale infrastructure. We find in the Climateworks decarbonisation scenarios, energy efficiency in housing improves by over 40% in the net zero to 2050 pathways. Of course, not only does that save energy, it improves health outcomes, comfort for occupants, property prices for owners, and of course, reduces overall energy demand at a time when electrification is increasing it. But responsibility for managing and implementing energy performance is currently spread across different governments, departments, and the energy system actors, including actors outside the energy system, those with oversight of buildings, industry, and transport. The challenge is that this approach is not coordinated, and that energy performance across and between the sectors is therefore not sufficiently informing energy system planning in the ISP. Currently, energy performance is treated as an input into the ISP, and there are significant assumptions made rather than as a component of the energy system to be modelled and planned for in order to inform the pathway for different sectors. The absence of a holistic approach or a single body with a duty to oversee and plan for improved energy performance on the demand side has led to an approach that lacks accountability, prioritisation and integration. So different actors too often are considering and accounting for only the activities in their purview and do so without the guidance of whole of economy energy performance planning. For example, government policy designed to deliver value for customers through household batteries and bidirectional electric vehicle charging is not well reflected in market system planning undertaken by energy system government bodies. And the equipment standards, interoperability and the orchestration potential are emerging in separate processes managed by ministers for buildings, ministers for transport, ministers for planning. Australia's energy system would benefit from a governance approach that enables effective integration of this energy performance on the demand side and then can model and plan for what's best for the whole system. I don't have a firm view as to whether a new body is best and needed for this, or whether the existing government energy governance bodies can be tasked with a responsibility for energy performance oversight. But what I do know is that a dedicated focus is needed to support a holistic approach to cohesive energy performance planning. So turning now to investment in the energy sector. Our next recommendation focuses on enabling a fit-for-purpose energy system, which is not just about what goes into planning and forecasting documents, but of course attracting the investment necessary for renewable generation, storage and transmission projects, so that we can move at the pace and scale required. So that is going to become increasingly difficult for energy companies and projects that do not have credible plans to transition to net zero. In June this year, the Australian Government released the Sustainable Finance Roadmap, which sets out a vision for sustainable finance reforms, and it was developed at the request of the finance community, who are seeking to do longer-term investment planning than the current guidance and governance provides, and also to ensure that companies and investors have credible and comparable information so that they can mobilise capital at the scale needed for the net zero transition. So as part of these reforms, as I mentioned earlier, there is legislation now requiring companies to disclose climate-related financial risks and opportunities in their annual reports, so that investors, shareholders and regulators have consistent information. The guidance for these is internationally aligned and is very comprehensive, so that companies disclosing these climate-related financial risks and opportunities need to disclose net zero targets if they have them, including interim 5-yearly targets and covering all 3 scopes of emissions. That includes the emissions of their customers and their supply chains. And of course, the energy system is in all those companies' supply chains. In addition, Treasury has sponsored the Sustainable Finance Taxonomy, which is currently a voluntary labelling scheme, but it provides consistent standards for classifying and verifying major infrastructure projects and assets for their environmentally sustainable criteria and their alignment with the net zero pathways that are required to achieve the Paris Agreement goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Together, these mechanisms will enable investors to differentiate between the companies professing to be green and those that are genuinely on track to decarbonise their projects and their operations. And so, as we've seen with greenwash regulation and litigation, these measures provide comfort to investors and guidance to companies, so that there is then the expectation that a company is not able to say they are net zero aligned unless they are actually aligned with the net zero goals in the Paris Agreement. These definitions have been developed with technical guidance from expert groups working its way through this Sustainable Finance Roadmap process led by Treasury. We expect this to be available by the middle of next year, providing a definition of what constitutes credible in transition plans as guidance to companies. And the taxonomy in Australia will join more than 30 taxonomies that exist around the world already. These provide measures to classify investments in activities as green or not, and they will be updated over time. Capital is global, as you know, and investors are looking at opportunities all around the world and using these definitions to create the trust and expectation that is where they seek to deploy their funds. The Australian Sustainable Finance Institute, who's managing this taxonomy process, recently shared in their online workshop, what we're seeking to do within the taxonomy is create and identify new green asset classes where Australia has a competitive advantage, as well as the transition opportunities for Australia, and showcase that to increase capital directed to our transition. This sets out very clear guidance, and what's new about the Australian taxonomy is that it's not only a label for what's already green, clearly already zero emissions, but there is an enormous new category for what is in transition. So that's assets that are currently brown and are on their way to being green. And there's quite granular emissions intensity targets, year by year, asset class by asset class, across energy infrastructure, transport, mining, resources, and agriculture also. And so to say that you can attract sustainable finance, even if you are not yet at net zero, provided you show that your investment plan, which has gone through your governance process in your company, meets these emissions trajectories that are aligned with the Paris Agreement. This guidance will be clear to all in the market within months. To follow that, The accounting and audit professions are developing standards to ensure that companies' net zero plans are robust and audited. And Climateworks has been convening with groups all around the world to harmonise the definitions of what does good enough mean for a credible transition plan. And all of this guidance will be publicly available to be ready for when this new legislative requirement makes the obligation for all companies and investors in Australia above a size threshold to include this information in their financial annual reports. The taxonomy labelling is currently optional. You only have to disclose a credible transition plan if you have one and if you're seeking to meet the standards of declaring yourself net zero aligned. But in my view, they're already part of the new normal of net zero, being a part of doing business and finance. Recent examples of this demonstration of investor and shareholder expectation and scrutiny include shareholders insisting that companies bring their net zero transition plans to the AGM for a vote. And we saw in July, 60% of Woodside shareholders voted down the company's climate transition plan, signalling dissatisfaction with its credibility and ambition. In August, we saw Commonwealth Bank announce that it will not fund any fossil fuel company that does not have an independently verified plan to cut all emissions from 2025 onward to disclose their plans. We saw in October, just last month, Vanguard fined $12 million by the federal court for greenwashing conduct after it misled customers about the ESG credentials of one of its funds. And so it is and will increasingly be more difficult to attract investment, particularly international investors, or a capital premium will be incurred for companies who do not have a credible plan to decarbonise in line with emission reduction targets and pathways. So it's important for the energy sector to keep pace with this, both to continue to attract capital into the energy sector, especially for companies exposed to institutional investment markets and exposed to ASIC disclosure monitoring, but also to be ready for the pressure from those companies that are now committing to these credible transition plans and expecting the energy services that they procure to be able to meet that. Ultimately, all energy companies within the NEM should be adopting credible transition plans and disclosing how they decarbonise their operations and the enabled emissions in their infrastructure in line with net zero pathways, so that our energy system can keep pace with the expectations of the financial system and attract the capital that we know is needed. So I'll cover in my next section how this development provides a circuit breaker opportunity for bringing government policy to the table on the question of who pays for which parts of the energy system decarbonisation. The net zero transition plans for our existing infrastructure for energy supply and distribution companies, who of course are heavily regulated. But this concept of credible transition plans and the normality of these existing across all sectors of the economy helps provide a tool for government and industry to discuss calmly outside of politics what these plans involve, what the investment requirements are, and what the contributions of public and private investors can be. Even without a requirement, the international trend to adopting these credible transition plans will push many of the NEM energy players to produce these plans nonetheless, due to their ownership and investment and investors and shareholders. Of course, companies that do pursue credible transition plans will be the better for it in terms of resilience, reputation, longer-term transition cost savings, and benefiting from the opportunities in this transition. So, to the final recommendation. Turning now to bringing this goal of embedding net zero transition plans into the goal of the energy market regulators, so that we can align the ambitions with the goals that the economic incentives are creating in the regulated part of the energy system. Of course, we all understand the NEM was designed 30 years ago for a very different time, and we're grappling with the economic signals that still stem from that structure. Back in 1998, when the NEM was established, the characteristics there at that time included stable demand growth, technologies that improved incrementally, and low-risk investment opportunities. We now have the legislation of the net zero target, the introduction of these net zero provisions, as I mentioned, in the national energy objectives and in financial disclosure objectives. And this has changed the game for the energy system. So now it's time for these goals to be fully incorporated through the NEM. I know you're very familiar with what the energy transition involves and requires the NEM governance structures to do, meeting the need for more generation while phasing out coal, planning for a decentralised energy system where it's far less predictable about where and by whom energy will be generated, of course maintaining the stability of the grid while accounting for variability, and evolving energy system rules to enhance energy performance and include the integration of distributed energy resources to support electrification. We're not saying this job is easy to combine all of these multiple goals, but it's much harder when the goals themselves are not embedded into the regulatory tools that control the way we price the energy services and infrastructure. So, what does it look like in practice to adjust this? We've looked at opportunities for how we can carry through this emissions goal into each of the elements of the system that generates those economic signals. We're going to taking a look at the electrification of reticulated gas networks as an example. The laws and regulations that govern the gas network system, as I mentioned, were designed in the earlier time with the focus on enabling its ongoing provision, not enabling the achievement of net zero. Under the net zero scenarios that Climateworks has modelled, we see gas use falling between 39 to 54% this decade by 2030 and up to 90% by 2050. But of course, the fall is much faster in buildings than in industry, where we see electrification driving gas use to near zero by mid-2040s. So of course, electrification in buildings and industries means that demand for gas decreases, impacting the economic and operational viability of the gas distribution network. But under the current system, the reticulated gas network still must be paid for and maintained under the current pricing structure. So it's clear that the current economic regulatory framework is out of step with the requirements now of credible net zero transition plans and the updates to the national energy objective. So without reform, this will lead to a situation where low-income earners and renters who have less capacity to electrify are left to cover the growing cost of maintaining an increasingly underutilised gas network. And addressing the orderly phase-out of gas requires recognising that in the update of regulatory and market frameworks, we also maintain our commitment to social equity and accelerate the alignment of these frameworks with these new national net zero goals. Fortunately, there are examples of this happening elsewhere in Australia and around the world. So first, take a look at the town of Esperance in Western Australia. From about a year, in April 22 to 23, the West Australian Government supported 400 customers to transition from gas following a decision by the Esperance Gas Distribution Company to end the gas supply there. The WA Government brokered a deal to keep gas on for an additional year and provided funding support to assist residents to electrify. Gas appliances were replaced with like-for-like electric appliances with funding provided by the WA Government. And with that support and accompanying customer engagement and information effort, 75% of customers electrified and the remainder transitioned to bottled gas. I know that exploration of targeted place-based approaches is also underway in other Australian jurisdictions. We also see examples in the US. In the state of Washington earlier this year, the Washington State Senate passed a bill that removed the obligation of the state's largest energy utility company, Puget Sound Energy, to provide gas to new and existing customers when requested to do so. And under the new law, they now have the option to meet the energy requirements of customers, if it's financially to do so, through emissions-free alternatives. They also have set targets of sourcing 80% of their energy from renewables by 2030 and 100% by 2045. And the state government is offering rebates to support low and middle income households to electrify. Now, there is currently a court challenge underway seeking to reinstate the status quo in Washington state. And that would require gas companies to continue to provide gas And of course, we know it is rare that major reforms such as these don't go without challenge. But I see it as part of the new normal of net zero goals being incorporated as part of business and government. And there will be more moves like this to ensure that the orderly shift away to net zero emission solutions is embedded in the goals of system planning, regulatory changes and financial measures. So, of course, it is the financial implications for end users and the gas network operators themselves that's proving to be among the most significant considerations. There's no escaping the reality of electrifications of buildings and decarbonisation of energy. So responsibility now sits with all players in the energy market, federal and state governments working with industry to determine when and where gas networks are closed, agreeing the shared contributions to how it's paid for, and supporting regulators with new frameworks and mandates that enable the pricing signals to make that happen smoothly. I've shown a couple of analogies already in particular locations, and there are also analogies for how governments have supported electricity supply technologies to enter and exit the market, and in sectors outside of energy as well. So it's time now for similar attention on electrification and gas phase out. And we can learn from many of the blended finance approaches that we've seen elsewhere. So, to conclude, today I've shared with you how the finance and business community is incorporating net zero targets and plans into their governance reporting, and how the energy system can do the same. We know there's no escaping the transition ahead of us, and so it's time to update the governance and planning in the energy system to align and enable Australia's future ambition as a renewable energy superpower that's servicing a decarbonised global economy. Right now, we have the opportunity of the Australian Government developing the electricity and energy sector net zero plan. And this can provide direction on all of the outcomes I've discussed today and the implementation steps to be taken. The progress is achievable, so it's time to lean in and shape it. Thank you.
Great. Got plenty of time for Q&A. Arms going up already. There you go. That's good. That's a good sign. How are we going to run microphones? Jolly good. We have Barnaby and Franca, who are our zealous microphone carriers. So hands up, and we'll get into some questions. So, gentlemen back there.
Oh, hi. I'd like you to address nuclear, the use of nuclear energy, because it seems to me Australia is similar to other countries like Canada, very similar in government as well as demographics, maybe. So what do you see are the major obstacles in adopting nuclear energy?
Mostly time now. So Climateworks has worked closely with CSIRO on our decarbonisation scenarios, looking at the technologies for over a decade now, and we update them every 3 years or so. And in our first versions, nuclear was very much a part of the considered likely future mix in terms of cost. And so we studied renewables, nuclear, coal with CCS, and a total system cost. And a decade ago, all three technologies were vying with each other on relatively similar total system cost basis. But the next time we updated it, less than 5 years later, nuclear had fallen behind in the cost race because renewables had leapfrogged forward so quickly. Being a modular technology, the cost falls outpaced the predictions that even we and CSIRO, using the best available data 5 years earlier, were able to forecast. So renewables has outperformed, and nuclear has not had any opportunity to be deployed in Australia due to the legal prohibition. And it's also not a modular technology, so its costs have not declined rapidly around the world either.
Didn't take us long to get into nuclear, did it?
Feel free to add.
No. Keep coming with the questions. We've got plenty of time. I encourage also diversity across the room, so there seems to be lots of questions on this side, but and also on types of question as well. Yes, sir.
Thanks. I'm Ian Blair. I'm in agriculture. And it concerns me that Ross Garno mentioned how important agriculture and carbon storage through agriculture. There's also 10,000 biogas generators all around the world, and there's now going to be a carbon price and evidence that biochar in soils can improve your productivity. So can you comment of how that, it does require integration of all the systems, but we've got prices on landfill, prices on carbon, and improvement of agricultural productivity and agroforestry. Can you comment, please?
Yes. And I gave a speech not long ago on the integration of nature-based solutions and carbon sequestration in landscapes with the net zero agenda. We could have as much of a session on that. So what we see, so you're absolutely right on the evidence. To achieve the net zero targets and pathways that I've outlined that are Paris aligned, we need a substantial uplift in natural-based sequestration, and also in what's called nature positive agricultural practices. So we can do both more use of landscapes for sequestering, but also changes to the agricultural processes and methods to do sequestration during agriculture. So we need as much of an acceleration in those activities as we do in the energy side, and I often do present to similar audiences on that topic indeed. In terms of integration of pricing, clearly that hasn't been successful around the world. There is not one pricing mechanism for carbon in Australia, but what we're seeing instead is this concept of credible transition plans is taking a more holistic view, the 30-year pathway that can do more than a single price can. That's not to say you don't need prices for credits for rewarding the technologies we're trying to call forward. So just as we've seen credits for small-scale solar, we're going to see credits for nature-positive farming. We're seeing carbon sequestration already having a priced credit. In addition, companies in the food sector will be required to do credible net zero transition plans. And what we're seeing is that the biodiversity and environmental standards are now beginning to be incorporated into the definitions of a credible net zero to recognise that we must also repair nature while we're achieving net zero.
Terrific. Gentleman over here.
Yeah, hi Anna, thanks for your presentation. You're pretty much preaching to the converted here this morning, obviously, and you mentioned that magic word politics in your presentation, and the first question we had obviously was interesting around nuclear. Given the craziness of politics right now, and it is crazy, and we're seeing, you know, very different understandings of our energy system being put forward, and particularly the retreat back to the concept of baseload power as an argument, for example, supporting nuclear. I haven't seen any evidence in Climateworks' work of you surveying public perception and understanding of this. Is this something you're looking at? Because this journey is going to require at some stage the public to come along fully. I have seen some evidence that the uptake of rooftop solar, for example, is being driven in outer suburbs by economic issues of people with uncertain economic futures looking to get off reliance on the grid, for example. So is Climateworks looking in this area, and how would it take that results of that sort of survey work forward?
Yes, great question. And we do indeed, I often look at our work inside an ecosystem, not the natural ecosystem, but the political ecosystem, but also the ecosystem of finance and consumers, as well as politics and policy. And so we work inside an ecosystem of other climate think tanks, and the Climate Council would be one that I would direct you to. They are surveying public sentiment. They're not the only one, there are many. The Smart Energy Council does some also, but the Climate Council has a new report out today on the uptake of solar, actually, and the appetite amongst Australian consumers and investors and their thesis is it's actually underappreciated. So the appetite is greater than the public narrative has suggested. And so they're playing an advocacy role in helping raise awareness that there is a much greater appetite in the broader community than makes its way to the headlines of the political debate. The mention of politics is also why I spent so much time on my speech on the finance sector, because the finance sector has moved very rapidly outside of and in spite of the politics in America and Europe, as well as here in Australia, because investors who manage our superannuation funds have a fiduciary duty to provide a retirement income in 30 years' time. So the economy and the climate in 2050 matters. And there are now directors' duties that make clear that if you are managing a long-term financial investment, you must take account of climate risk and the transition. So that has accelerated progress and actually made it easier to achieve some of the policy progress, because it's made more visible that this is a question of business. It's not a question of politics only anymore. And those new standards are being incorporated into the AASB, the Australian Accounting Standards Board. So we're seeing this normalisation that gives me quite a degree of encouragement that these issues will eventually move beyond politics. You're right, we're not there yet, but there is a lot of work going on that lays the foundation for that.
Now we'll have one more question. I'm keen to have, hang on, Barnaby. That question's from someone who's got the chance to speak themselves for an hour in a little while. So one more question from the gentleman here, and then I'll ask a question, okay, and we'll close out the session.
Yeah, I wonder if you could touch on the issue of energy justice, how you approach this at Climateworks. Because if we look around the world, including in Australia, there are some people, even under a renewables scenario, that use a great deal of energy, much more than others. And there are people around the world that have barely any access to energy. And I'm thinking specifically at the moment, the victims of the genocide that is going on in Gaza as we speak. So I know that's a very complex issue, and I'm not even sure whether it is achievable under the existing global economy. But anyway.
There are many aspects of energy justice, and we run a program focused on the just energy transition. There's also a global that you may like to explore called Energy for All, which is indeed operating with the support of United Nations to focus on energy access. The energy justice also includes what I mentioned earlier about social equity on prices of energy during this transition, and access to the ability to electrify rather than being unable to move off fossil fuel. Also, we have an office in Jakarta, and our team in Monash, Indonesia, focuses on energy justice from this perspective of also supporting developing economies to be able to thrive in a prosperous decarbonised economy. And if we think about our energy transition being difficult, there are 10 times as many people in Indonesia, and they also need to move off a very coal-fired power system. And they are suffering health impacts and air pollution impacts from the fossil fuel intensity of their economy and their transport system. So the faster that Australia can help bring rapid technological development to a zero emissions economy is very important that we deploy it to our neighbours as well in Southeast Asia. So there are many aspects of energy justice, and we're working on some of them.
Very terrific. And the host's privilege. You mentioned, I think it was your first or second point about industrial zones and the chicken and egg problems of those industrial zones. I'm involved in one at the moment, and it's not moving as quickly as we would have hoped, because we're struggling to get someone to buy the energy that this part of an industrial zone will produce. With those chicken and egg problems, how do we bring in people from outside Australia into that planning to help us establish those zones as buyers?
Absolutely. That is the fastest way to do so. So, how do you? One of the reasons the zones struggle is they're collective spaces, so there's not a single owner. So who is it that gets on the plane to Japan and Korea and brings those buyers here? Ultimately, that's the type of incentive that has enabled market making in most private markets. So there are some opportunities for that. We are seeing an increase in the policy making awareness of green trade opportunities. And one of the reasons that many of us are interested in Australia hosting the COP, the UN climate meeting in 2 years' time, is that that's a very good platform to bring international parties to the table. But also the new Net Zero Economy Authority is deliberately tasked with being a front door for investors. So this market making that you're referring to is a very important gap to lean into. It's one that we know at Climate Week New York last month, a new alliance focused on green market makers was established to try and help this brokering that you need to understand the green commodity, you need to recognise the premium, bring the buyers to the table with the sellers and essentially do what we call blended finance. Are the commercial terms there for them to do a direct trade? If not, do they need support from public investors or government investors that want to establish themselves early as leaders in this space and also want to do it for geopolitical partnership reasons? So for the early ones, we reckon it's going to be a lot of partnership brokering, but there are some positive green shoots, if you like, of activity around the world. But ultimately, it's a lot of brokering engagement that's still needed.
And what role do you think government has in helping manage the risk? Because a lot of these hubs are first of a kind building of something.
Yeah.
And even if it's an established technology elsewhere, I've never done it before, you've never done it before here.
Yep.
And that's a substantial commercial or technical or other risks for many companies.
It is indeed. So that's why government's putting billions of dollars on the table. Like that's what the Future Made in Australia money's for. That's what the National Reconstruction Fund is for. We've seen it in battery storage with the capacity investment scheme. We saw it even in the early days. The Clean Energy Finance Corp de-risked the first large-scale solar farms. Now look at the market doing them, without government support. So government always helps at the start, and we're going to need to see quite a lot more of that. And of course, ultimately, some of the challenge of the chicken and egg is because, as Melbourne Uni colleague Ross Garno would say, in the absence of a market price on carbon, the market is harder to make. So we're patching it together with these other arrangements, and that's the way forward until we can also add green premium pricing or brown pollution pricing.
Great, terrific. Well, look, thanks, Anna. Please thank Anna. And thanks everybody for your time this morning. It was a wonderful talk and great. We don't catch up as often as we should. I think we had lunch about a year and a half ago last time. But wonderful talk, Anna. Thank you very much. We've got a full schedule today and we're going to split off into two parallel sessions. One staying in this room, isn't it, Franca?
Yes, so we have energy systems in here.
Energy systems in here, moderated by my colleague, Professor Pierluigi Mancarella. And energy materials in the room next door, moderated by Wallace Wong, who's probably next door. So thank you. That's the opening session wrapped up, and please enjoy the rest of the day.